Air pollution in British cities is currently a major issue of concern. A recent Commons Select Committee on Environment estimated that somewhere in the region of 50,000 people died premature deaths in 2015, mainly as a result of traffic fumes in city centres. So respiratory deaths are rising to levels that were last seen in the Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 19th century, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 people every year died of bronchitis, a bronchitis group of diseases, which had unobtrusively become the nation's commonest cause of death. Commenting on today's crisis, a Guardian editorial cautioned against a council of despair, as they put it, pointing out that Britain was the first country to pass Clean Air Acts to deal with the coal-filled smogs of the 1950s. So we were leading the world. Smoke was a problem in the first industrial city. It was a place where ideas about how to solve it had to be worked out. And the Clean Air Acts in the first one in 1956 was a globally important piece of legislation that tackled this problem effectively for the first time. But what the Guardian editorial neglects to point out is it took more than a century to put this piece of legislation in place. So what I'd like to do in the talk this afternoon is, on the anniversary of the Clean Air Act, talk about why it took so long to clear the skies over places like Manchester and Leeds, which is pictured here in 1896, a view of Kirkstall Road in Leeds. So a little context then. Britain, of course, was the first industrial nation. Rapid urban industrial expansion with coal from the abundant sources of local coalfields providing energy to run mills, factories, and not only that, people's homes too. The coal fire was hugely important and also ran on coal, providing heat, light, ventilation, hot water, and the like. In these fast expanding cities, population was growing rapidly. Britain's urban population grew from 11 million in 1800 to around 50 million by 1951. So massive increase in population, and this was also accompanied by rising fuel consumption. Coal consumption in 1800 was just 10 million tonnes per annum. It had risen to 200 million tonnes per annum in 1950. And so rising smoke emissions meant rising problems caused by the smoke, particularly in places like Manchester, Leeds, London, where the smoke haze became an everyday part of life. It was omnipresent. And smoke caused all sorts of problems. Firstly, if we look at some nasty facts, as pointed out in this 1930s leaflet, sunshine was one of the big problems, or lack of it, should say. So meteorological records for Leeds show that by the early years of the 20th century, Leeds was receiving only around 50% of all possible sunlight. So sunshine was a problem. Common to have night at noon in the 19th, early 20th centuries. But it also had a knock-on effect, of course, on health. Lack of sunshine combined with lack of vitamin D in the diet meant that rickets, a disease of childhood, that meant the bone formation was hindered, bones didn't form properly. Rickets was endemic in Victorian cities like Leeds. So rickets was a big problem. It led to theories of degeneration in the city, worries about the future of urban populations. But of course, respiratory diseases were also a big part of what people were concerned about by the early years of the 20th century. Asthma, bronchitis, tuberculosis, all linked to rising levels of air pollution in the city. We've heard about large numbers of people suffering from bronchial diseases. Asthma was a big problem too, and also tuberculosis. TB was thought to be, the incidence of TB was thought to increase because people were spending too much time indoors. The outdoor environment was so unpleasant that people hunkered down indoors. They didn't go out very much, which facilitated the transmission of the disease. And sunshine was also thought to be nature's disinfectant. It had an antibacterial quality that people were very concerned about. It was nature's disinfectant, so sunlight wasn't able to do its work in the city, killing bacteria that cause diseases like bronchitis, tuberculosis. And smoke fogs were also a big problem. Pea supers would descend on cities and stay for about a week at a time in some instances. This cartoon, Old King Cole and the Fog Demon, was produced in 1880, created after a week-long smog in London that, according to contemporary figures, killed around 2,000 people in the space of a few weeks during and after the smoke fog. And if those of you with sharp eyes will be able to see that written in the smoke-filled air, you have asthma, bronchitis, pneumonia, pleurisy, phthisis, and I could go on. So contemporaries were already making the link between the smoke-filled air and the high incidence of these diseases. This particular leaflet also points out that smoke fogs were a problem into the early 20th century too. It highlights a Glasgow fog in 1909, which caused the deaths of some 500 Glaswegians, leading Glasgow's chief sanitary officer, Peter Fife, to call it a civic crime. Civic crime because these deaths were avoidable, the result of businessmen and householders burning raw coal in their factories, in their homes. And J. Johnston Jervis, medical officer for health in the early years of the 20th century for Leeds, he put it this way. This is what he had to say about the high incidence of respiratory deaths. I feel on safe ground when I say that the majority of lives lost from respiratory diseases are lives thrown away. Their prevalence and the high mortality rate due to them are a grave indictment of our modern civilization. They are preventable, yet they are not prevented. They are curable, yet they continue to kill. Prevention can only be achieved by tackling the smoke problem resolutely. And it wasn't just the effect on human health that was at the foremost of contemporary minds. Indeed, the aesthetic effects of smoke probably attracted more public attention. Monumental public buildings like Leeds Town Hall, whose anniversary I'm reliably informed is today, opened in 1858, did you say, Tosh? Yeah. Well, these public buildings soon blackened and decayed, defaced by soot and grime. In his 1934 book, English Journey, J.B. Priestley described Leeds as a large, dirty town, mostly built of sooty brick. The smuts, the soot aren't just a problem, also acid rain. The term acid rain was coined in 1859 by the Manchester scientist Robert Angus Smith to describe the corrosive action of local rainwater on the great public buildings of Manchester at the time. The sulphur in smoke emissions reacts with water in the air to cause acid rain, and it starts to become a big problem. Not only does stonework blacken, it starts to crumble. And not only that, major historic buildings like York Minster and Westminster Abbey were also starting to be hit by this kind of a problem. Architects started to adapt by the last years of the 19th century. In Leeds, for example, we have good examples. They start to use terracotta in their designs. Terracotta added a splash of colour to drab city streets, but crucially, it was easy to clean. So there is adaptation in that kind of response. If we're thinking about human health too, rather than cure the smoke problem, sun lamps were big for children in the early years of the 20th century. And we start to give children things like cod liver oil to address the dietary deficiencies. We don't solve the problem, we adapt to it. And we have a great example of one of the few buildings left in Leeds that hasn't been cleaned since the 1970s. I'm reliably informed that this is now a nightclub, but I'm a little old to know this for sure. But you can see it stands out. It's the blackness of the building, stark contrast with the white Portland stone of a Parkinson building behind. I have an architect friend who actually would like to list one or two buildings like this as a reminder, a monument to the industrial past, because so few of these buildings that remind us of the fabric of the city in the 19th, early 20th centuries, so few still exist. As well as the architecture, smoke has a devastating impact on urban vegetation too, greatly reducing biodiversity. Parks and gardens became dominated by species that could withstand the smoke. Species such as plane and poplar trees, privets, rhododendrons, basically plants with very shiny leaves. In terms of the damage that's done around the city, a couple of Leeds scientists, Julius Cohen, Arthur Ruston, wrote an influential book in 1912, Smoke, A Study of Town Air. They actually worked at Leeds University up the road. Their research actually is still highly regarded today in scientific circles because it shows the damaging effects of smoke and sulphur deposition on the natural world. They experimented using soil conditions that were the same at the start of the experiment, growing things like radishes and lettuce in different areas of the city. And we can see from this very sort of simple but effective photo that in semi-rural Garforth, you can grow a fairly decent lettuce for your tea. But I'm afraid in industrial Hunslet, you aren't going to have much to go on. And it was the same story for other crops that they planted around the city. The smoke problem then hadn't been tackled resolutely, as Johnston Jarvis would have liked. And early anti-smoke legislation offered little protection to city dwellers or the environment. Laws start to be passed as early as the 1840s. Local acts to legislate against smoke started to be passed in places like Manchester from the 1840s, Derby too. There are smoke clauses in the famous Public Health Act of 1875. And there's another go in 1926, the Smoke Abatement Act of 1926 is passed. There are others too, laws passed specifically to deal with smoke in London, but they all suffer from the same problems. They all have the same common problems. They all have the same flaws. Firstly, a best practicable means clause, an ambiguous best practicable means clause. The best practicable means of abatement didn't mean the latest technology to solve the smoke problem. It actually meant apparatus that industrialists felt they could afford to deal with the problem, however rudimentary. So it's a good get-out clause. You say you've had a go, and that's good enough. Insignificant fines, very low fines on offenders, all the way through the series of legislation from the 1840s right down to the 1950s. It essentially gives industrialists a license to pollute. Even the few offenders that are taken before the courts, and there aren't many, are fined very derisory sums. So industrialists can afford to just pay the fine and carry on as before. It's not a deterrent. And exemptions, most notably the domestic hearth. Householders aren't going to be told what they can and can't burn in their own homes. So domestic hearths are exempt, which means that half the smoke problem in cities goes completely unaddressed. And industries that use power intermittently, like iron and steel, pottery, food industries, those that need to use fuel intermittently, need power intermittently, they're exempted too. So there were big exemptions under these laws. So basically they didn't work very well. And we have to remember that the machinery of enforcement is in the hands basically of local businessmen at this time. So they're not that keen on enforcing legislation that's going to hit growth and business. So it doesn't happen. And one reason why legislation was so lax was that smoke pollution wasn't viewed solely as a negative thing by contemporaries. It was evidence that towns and cities were flourishing economically. In the words of Reuben Spencer, chairman of Rylands and Sons, Manchester's biggest cotton textile company, smoke was the incense of industry. And it's reflected in postcards like Beautiful Manchester. Every city had one of these. Beautiful Sheffield, and so on and so forth. But they portray, they're sort of darkly humorous, but they do portray the dynamism, vitality of the city. Belching smokestacks did signify work and commercial activity to contemporaries. Postcards transmit cultural values that celebrate industrial smoke as a symbol of progress. And these were enduring ideas. These are general election posters from the 1930s, shortly after the Great Depression hits hard. For the national government. National government will keep those stacks of work going. So again, an easily understandable message to contemporaries, which seemed to hit home. The national government was returned with large majorities in 1931 and 1935. And the second poster, Smokeless Chimneys and Anxious Mothers. We can see that the townscape behind the tall smoking chimneys, they're not, basically. Smokeless chimneys mean hard times for contemporaries. And this is represented in the concerned mother, the distressed children. These are posters that are aimed at the working classes, but we should remember too that the 1928 Equal Franchise Act had just been passed. So this particular poster could be seen as appealing directly to women who now have the vote. And we mustn't forget the number of workmen in the background, also despondent, idle hands thrust deep into empty pockets. So both before and after the Second World War, these sorts of images are still commonplace. Hard to break the link between economic activity and air pollution. But smoke from the traditional fireplace was also perhaps an even bigger problem, because domestic smoke was emitted at street level. Unlike the tall factory chimneys, they're a technology basically to shoot smoke straight up into the atmosphere. The erroneous idea was that the atmosphere, it was a great sea of air that could basically dilute pollution until it was totally harmless. So you built yourself really tall chimneys and the smoke disappeared harmlessly. We all know now that that's not strictly true. But domestic smoke emissions from the household hearth were more of a problem because emitted at street level, they were much harder to disperse. They were thought to cause more of a problem where damage to the environment and health was concerned. But in the public mind, they're more associated with pleasant ideas of domestic well-being, home comforts. As this image by Sam Fitton, a Lancashire dialect author and artist, it's cowed to neat. I think I can probably do that just about okay. Lots of images like this, they abound. Lots of literary images too. In 1867, L.M. Budgeon set out some of the powerful attractions that the hearth held for contemporaries. She said it so. But the fire, the dear familiar fire that lights up our hearth and faces round it. Nobody need be told that the fire which looks out at us so cheerily from the bars is the companion of the solitary, the comforter of the sad, the enlivener of the dull, the magnet of social attraction. In a word, the sun, when the summer sun is wanting, of every domestic system, hence its very life. Not forgetting its vulgar but particularly vital uses as roaster of the joint and boiler of the kettle. Can't have a good cup of tea without the open fire to boil your kettle on. Some 7 decades later, social survey data highlighted the British public's continuing attachment even to the open coal fire. During the summer of 1939, mass observation as a part of an inquiry into people's homes, asked the question, what type of heating would you like if you could choose? And there were many of these social surveys around this time through the Second World War, because obviously it offered a big opportunity to reconstruct Britain's cities, to use the latest technologies, to maybe abate smoke and make cities better places to live. 73% of respondents opted for an open coal fire. 73. Homeliness and cheerfulness were 2 of the main reasons the public gave for preferring the traditional open hearth. And in the other social surveys, actually, the figures were even higher. A survey in Scotland, respondents, over 90% said that they wanted an open coal fire. So they were still hugely popular. And the government wasn't taking a lead on this. The repercussions of interfering with this great British institution were thought to be high for the government. There were no votes in clearing the skies. So no government seriously considered telling people what they could and couldn't burn in their own home. Rather like today, imagine if a government went to the polls on the idea that they were going to ban car use in the city. Good luck with that one. So a lack of political will to solve the smoke problem on the part of the government meant that campaigning groups like the National Society for Clean Air had taken the lead in this campaign, in this struggle for clean air. The publications officer for the National Society for the National Smoke Abatement Society, I should say, Arnold Marsh, in 1947. In 1947, he reported that for millions of town dwellers, the idea that smoke is a problem, something to be prevented, simply does not exist. So they have their work cut out to change perceptions of smoke, to make people see smoke differently, to change the narrative. Instead of progress and prosperity, to see emissions as signifying ill health and inefficiency. And from the 1840s, clean air associations are springing up in Britain's cities, starting with the Manchester Association for the Prevention of Smoke in 1842. The Leeds Smoke Abatement Committee in 1890, Julius Cohen was active in setting up this particular organisation. And the National Smoke Abatement Society in 1929. From local societies, we start to have an umbrella, a national society, to cover the whole of the country by the 20th century. In terms of the vehicles that they use to get their message across, smoke abatement exhibitions were important. They start to be organised in large numbers, and they are open to the public to show smoke abatement appliances, gas, electric, other smokeless fuels, working effectively and efficiently, to show that smoke actually could be abated. It was possible to abate smoke. Not only that, in the age before social media, posters were extremely important in getting messages across to the public. The National Smoke Abatement Society ran a poster competition in conjunction with a newspaper, the News Chronicle, a liberal leading daily newspaper with a circulation of around 1 million readers at the turn of the 20th century. And prize-winning entries like this were published as a supplement to the newspaper. The idea is, of course, using this motif of a sunflower, life suffers without light. Away with smoke. So the notion of trying to make cities greener, cleaner, healthier places, the way that vegetation struggled to survive in Britain's cities was used as a commonplace analogy to show that human health must suffer if basically in some Manchester parks, for example, even grass wouldn't grow. So posters are important in getting the message across. And pamphlets too. This is a pamphlet specifically aimed at the citizens of Leeds. Clean Air for Leeds, what it means to your health and to your pocket. And this was produced in the 1930s. We have a rather gleaming vision of the town hall in the top right-hand corner there. The smoke that we see emitted in the bottom left-hand corner here has been abated in this utopian future where the sun, of course, is shining brightly. Sunshine, by the way, is hugely important to contemporaries. It is thought to be a real tonic to health. We tend to think of it as harmful in the 21st century. Very different ideas about the value of sunlight in the first half of the 20th century. And to get a hearing, campaigners are having to make an economic argument. They're having to try and persuade contemporaries that it's to their benefit to abate this problem. And so housewives in particular are asked to weigh the cost of smoke in time, trouble, money and health. Housewives, of course, are hit with the main burden of dealing with the smoke nuisance, as it was sometimes known. They were tasked with keeping homes and belongings clean, keeping children healthy, often in impossible circumstances. So housewives are encouraged to tot up how much money actually it costs them in extra cleaning, washing and dusting. Sammy Soot is the villainous figure there on the other side of the scale there. So work it out for your own house. So how much it's going to cost you in extra washing every week. Of course, extra medical costs through bad health. No National Health Service before the Second World War, so you had to pay for medical treatment. And the extra cost of waste up the chimney. It had long been recognised that the open hearth was actually a very inefficient technology. 80% of the heat at least went up the chimney with the smoke, to no benefit of anybody. And campaigners in these organisations like to push the idea of a black smoke tax, something that every urban citizen had to pay, that added to household bills on a weekly basis. So trying to make a counter-argument to this idea that muck equated with money. Actually, increasingly the argument is that smoke is waste and inefficiency, and that it hits householders in the pocket. And this also has an impact on a wider national economic scale. The gas industry, gas and coke, work for our wealth and health. The gas industry created the sinister Sammy Soot, but they also created Mr. Therm in 1931. The creation of renowned and successful artist and illustrator Eric Fraser. Mr. Therm, with his distinctive flame-like body, personified the gas industry for over 30 years. It's the second most successful cartoon advertising figure of all time after the Michelin Man, created in 1898. So contemporaries became very familiar with Mr. Therm, and the idea here that he's pushing is that smoke is actually a fortune wasted up the chimney. As well as hitting householders in their own pockets, which disapproving Mr. Therm, as he surveys the smoking chimney pots, points out, lots of valuable byproducts that could be reclaimed from processing coal in retorts to create gas and coke, smokeless fuels for use in the home. If we took this path, then not only would householders save money, but also lots of valuable byproducts that were useful in things like medicine, agriculture, that would help to build the wealth of the nation. We can see in the smoke-filled air insecticides, plastics, fertilizers, medicines. So he's turning the traditional narrative on its head. Smoke is increasingly seen as waste and inefficiency. Gas and electricity market themselves basically as the answer to the smoke problem. Gas and coke, the fuel of clean homes and clean cities. Electricity, Smokeless power, fumeless heat, flameless light. Cleaner cities, healthier cities, happier people. And these technologies would provide heat and power at the flick of a switch. Very convenient, very modern. And increasingly moral pressure put on consumers. What's going up your chimney? The idea that a good citizen would abate their smoke, would be a good neighbour, would think about the well-being of the nation and one's friends, family, and other city dwellers. So lots of encouragement to move to cleaner fuels by the 1930s. But the problem is, of course, that these alternative technologies are more expensive. Gas is roughly twice the price of coal. Campaigners talked about the curse of cheap coal. They were already pointing out decades ago that fossil fuels, the price of fossil fuels didn't reflect their actual cost in harm to health, harm to environment, harm to people's pockets. The answer to smoke on the one hand, but still out of most people's reach at this time. And we mustn't neglect the cultural obstacles too. In 1945, for example, George Orwell, journalist, novelist, he wrote a very spirited defence, lengthy defence of the open hearth. Just after the Second World War, he wrote, "A coal fire is wasteful, dirty, and inefficient. But a gas or electric fire is a dull thing by comparison." So advertisements and cartoons presented key issues of the day in powerful and memorable ways that were easily understood by the viewing public. And by the 1950s, this idea of smoke being wasteful and inefficient is becoming the dominant narrative. Campaigners are winning the war. This is a cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mirror in 1954 by the well-known political cartoonist Victor Weiss, Vicky, lifelong socialist, one of Britain's most influential political cartoonists. And the Daily Mirror, left-leaning publication, had around 5 million readers at this time. So this image, not a million miles away from the image of beautiful Manchester, starts to tell a very different story about what smoke means for contemporaries. Nevertheless, it took the world's biggest air pollution disaster at the time, the Great Smog of December 1952. Again, we have the smog demon reappearing again more than 7 decades later in the Daily Mail this time. They have to be good for something. The smog demon making his message clear to contemporaries. According to official figures, 4,000 Londoners died in the Great Smog of 1952, but more recent research has it that it was more likely to be 12,000 deaths during this week-long smog in December 1952. It saw public opinion shift decisively in favour of smoke abatement, although the government was still lagging behind popular opinion. At first, it tries to blame these deaths on a flu epidemic. Dirty air, though, was finally recognised to be as significant a public health problem as polluted water supplies had been in the 19th century, allowing the government to act. The Clean Air Act of 1956 saw the establishment of smokeless zones in towns and cities across the country, where the use of coal was banned, and in people's homes too, for the first time. Importantly, it provided for substantial grants to householders to offset the cost of installing smokeless technologies in their homes. They couldn't have afforded to do it otherwise. And landlords were refusing to do it. Most homes were rented at this time. But urban skies were still slow to clear. It took decades to convert millions of homes to new smokeless technologies, and there were shortages of smokeless fuels. To put it in some kind of context, Manchester's smoke control programme wasn't complete until 1985, almost 3 decades later. And as coal smoke abated, the car was becoming a problem. As early as 1945, there were already problems with traffic blocks, as they were called, in city centres. And as more sunlight penetrated city streets, it reacted with car exhaust emissions to create photochemical smog, equally hazardous to health. As I highlighted at the start of the lecture, 50,000 deaths in Britain last year. Premature deaths from respiratory diseases, mainly due to diesel exhaust emissions. So poor air quality remains one of the leading public health problems in Britain's cities today. And it's worth noting too that Leeds was named by the World Health Organization as one of Britain's 10 pollution hotspots. Only earlier this year. As traffic increases on our roads then, dangerous summer smog episodes have replaced the dark winter fogs of the age of smoke. So although urban air is clearer, it's still not clean. So to briefly conclude then, the Clean Air Act is widely regarded today as a landmark piece of legislation, not just in Britain, as I said, but globally in the development of environmental regulation. But when seen in the context of more than a century of campaigning by smoke abatement organisations and more than a century of government and public inaction, it can be argued that the 1956 Clean Air Act was long overdue. Are there any lessons to be learned from this particular study of the past, given that the mix of today's pollutants is so very different? Well, I'd argue that there are. Firstly, cultural obstacles to pollution control are not easily overcome. For example, the authorities, the government, are talking about new clean air zones in cities to deal with the traffic problem. But will people be willing to leave their cars at home? Stronger political leadership is required on environmental issues, on public health issues like air quality. Currently, organisations like Friends of the Earth are pushing this agenda, not the government. And lastly, organising to mitigate or adapt to other slow onset disasters, such as climate change, whose effects are not as obvious to the public, will also be challenging. And finally, I will stop, I swear. In post-industrial Britain, we tend to think of air pollution from coal as being a thing of the past, that the dark age of smoke is over. But we've outsourced our pollution to the Far East. China, the new workshop of the world, gets to see blue skies oftentimes only on screen today. China, incidentally, consumes 3 billion tonnes, more than 3 billion tonnes of coal every year, almost as much as the rest of the world combined. And according to World Health Organization figures, outdoor air pollution caused 3.7 million premature deaths worldwide in 2012. 3.7 million, mainly in the cities of China and India. So smoke hasn't gone away, and it's now the world's biggest environmental health risk. Thanks very much.